The purpose of this video is to explain at a very high level my approach to teaching people how to play music by ear and why I think almost anybody can do that given time. So the first thing is, what is playing by ear? Well, my definition is the ability to be able to play back on a musical instrument sounds that you hear in your mind without making any mistakes and having to pick around at it. So, for example, if you can hear in your mind the sounds you might want to be able to play that on the piano. So how do you do that? Well, maybe we think, I'll just memorize all the sounds, and once I know what they all are and I can tell you what they are, then I can hear them and I can play them. So, how many sounds are there to memorize? Well, the unfortunate answer to that is there are an infinite number of sounds to memorize. If you learned in math as a kid that there are an infinite number of points on a line and you thought about that and it blew your mind, well, the same thing's true with music. There's an infinite possible number of pitches. So how do you memorize them all? Well, the answer is you don't. You don't need to. You shouldn't have to. And the main reason for that is that humans are very attuned not to individual sounds or individual frequencies of sound, but more to the distances between sounds, what we call intervals in music. So, for example, if I played this tune, most of you will recognize that as the common children's tune, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Suppose I play this instead. Chances are you recognize that as the same song, Twinkle, Twinkle. And if you'd heard it without the first one, you would have still thought Twinkle, Twinkle. And yet, every pitch that I played, every frequency, I'm using the terms pitch and frequency a little bit interchangeably here, every frequency that I played was completely different from the first version. Why did you recognize that? It's because the distances between the sounds were the same. Once I started on some pitch, every interval that I used after that was the same as in the first version, and that's what you recognize. So, for example, if I played this and changed my intervals a little bit, you would not recognize that as Twinkle, Twinkle. Now, some of you may have recognized, because I'm using that example, that the rhythm was the same. But I can almost guarantee that if you heard that without the context of me talking about Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you would not associate it at all. So what you're interested in is relative pitches. So if you can learn how to hear and play relative pitches, then you can play by ear. So instead of knowing how many different pitches are there, let's talk about how many different intervals are there. Well, of course, there's an infinite number of those as well. But we can talk about how many intervals do people commonly use and learn those, and then you can play most of the music that you want to. So let's look at the piano. We've got 88 different sounds here, including the black keys, of course. We don't want to memorize all 88. The intervals between those are quite a few as well. But there's this thing called a scale that we humans, many of us, use in most of the music that we make. And there are different types of scales, and there are different scales that are slightly different in different cultures, different parts of the world. But let's take one that most of you are probably familiar with that sounds something like this. In Western Hemisphere music, that's called a major scale. And you can start that same pattern on any pitch. Let's try a different pitch, but do the same intervals. And if you learn that scale and the intervals within that scale, you can learn how to deal with most music that you hear, no matter which pitch it begins on. So then we want to know how many intervals do we have to memorize inside of that scale. Well, there's 12. There's 12 that could be used in there. But certainly more intervals are more common than others. So for example, the interval that we call an octave or an eighth sounds like this. If I play it somewhere else, it might sound like this. Here. That's a very common interval. We use that a lot. That's one of the first ones you should learn. Another one called the fifth sounds like this. Here, here. Those are all fifths. Another one you will probably want to learn. Now, I've found that in teaching to play by ear, there's a couple of approaches. The one that was taught to me, but I ended up not favoring, is to learn the 12 different types of intervals as individual 12 different little pieces. And I was taught to memorize the sounds of those by little songs that started with those intervals. But I had to learn, or I was on a path being taught to learn all of those things, and I kind of had to learn all of them or most of them before I could really put them together in a song, in a long song, not just the first 2 notes of a song that taught me to memorize it. And the other way that I've seen and that I have adopted and like to use is to teach people the sound of the major scale and learn the intervals inside of that, the most common ones first, and relate it directly to songs. You learn about the concept of the home key or the tonic or the keynote, which is the first note of the scale if you learn numbers of the scale. And then you learn some of the sounds from that first note up, maybe up to here, maybe back down, and then you learn this fifth. And if you just learn those sounds, you can learn a lot about music and the fundamentals of music and the chords in music. And you can even play those little sounds in different places. We call it transposing, just starting on different pitches or frequencies. And you can make interesting music just by taking those little intervals and moving them around. So and little by little, you can learn to expand your musical playing by ear repertoire. So, in short, the approach that I take to teaching people to play by ear is teaching them the sounds of the major scale and how to find the home key sound. There's a few tricks and tips around that. And then expanding on memorizing the sound of the first 3 tones of the scale, being able to hum them, being able to hear them and write them down, being able to hear them and play them back. And then we just kind of go out from there. We go to the 4th note of the scale and down to the special thing called the leading tone, and you memorize those, and then you learn the 5th of the scale, and you go down and you learn the relative minor note of the scale. This gets into music minor keys and minor scales, which are very related to the major scales. And little by little, as you memorize these sounds and work with them, you can learn to play them and use them just like you can learn a speaking language, your native language, or a language that you studied in school or on Duolingo or learned in some other way. So the language of music, the sound of music, is something you can learn to do. You do need a little patience and it takes some time. But I like to teach that, and I think you can do that, and that's where I start. Thank you for listening to this video.